Afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all doing well tonight, and we're so excited to get Energy Nights started. I'm here to introduce our first keynote speaker, Ryan Gillis. Ryan will present on Thiozen, a research and development company focused on increasing the efficiency, lowering costs, and lowering the environmental impact of oil and gas processes. Currently, Thiozen is targeting sulfur gas processing and hydrogen production. Help me in welcoming Ryan to MIT Energy Nights 2020. We'll be holding a Q&A session after the presentation, so please hold your questions until the end. And you can do that through the Q&A feature on Zoom. Hey, Ryan, take it away with your presentation.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me? I'll
Yep,
assume yes. Okay, great. And maybe you stay on the line 1 second to make sure I get this set up correctly. Are you seeing the right side or are you seeing my side?
We can see your presentation and then also see your video.
Okay, perfect. I want to thank Anna for the presentation, for the organizing team of these MIT Energy Nights for inviting me. I'm a little surprised. I don't feel like I have anyone, especially special or distinguished to be a keynote speaker, but I'm certainly honored to be here. I think we're going to break a little bit from the description a little bit. I'm not going to focus so much on the specifics of Thiozen and get all into the nitty-gritty technology details. Instead, I'm going to sort of present a wider overview of how you, both the MIT community and much more broadly, might think about approaching big problems and how sort of maybe a methodology that you can find to find credible solutions. And along that way, we'll get through the technology, don't worry. But you'll sort of take myself as a case story and what I've done on this journey, which I'm certainly not done with yet. I would also note that I have a 9-month-old son. As I was practicing this talk, he fell asleep. So I hope that the audience, I hope it's not so boring that the audience falls asleep as well. You can see his going to sleep has forced me down to the basement, which sort of explains the peeling paint in the background. But without further ado, we'll move forward. My name is, as was said, is Ryan. I just graduated with my doctorate in chemical engineering, or course 10, about 3 months ago, and founded Thiozen. And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Here's sort of a flashy title, Fire and Brimstone, a research story of sulfur and energy. That's what I wanted my thesis to be called, but my advisor, Bill Green, said it was a little bit too I don't know, flamboyant or something. So anyway, so we're going to present this in a few different ways. The first is really to find a problem that you care about. For me, that problem turned out to be climate change. We'll talk about that in a second. And the second step is really to brainstorm and then eventually find a solution that you believe in. The final step is to find markets or people that care about solving this problem the most. And the final step, and really what I'm in the midst of right now, is executing to scale it up and make that this sort of solution a reality. So this all, as I think many of the talks in the MIT Energy Nights will come down to, the big motivator is really climate change. Here's sort of a NASA graphic. I think it'll start going in a moment, but essentially the idea is that climate change is coming. And it's sort of a fundamental truth that we've mispriced a lot of things in our world, in our economies, in our societies. As climate change intensifies, this mispricing will become more and more apparent. And eventually there will have to be a connection, or a correction, I should say. And sort of the point of all these solutions is really to try and preempt this, to minimize human suffering and to take advantage of this truth that eventually we're going to have to address this big elephant in the room. I'm not much of a climate economist, but I read the UN reports. And as we look at them, we can see that here's a table from one that I think is pretty informative. I think it's predicting the economic impacts of climate change by country, and I'm not sure if it's 2050 or 2100, but the results are pretty striking. Almost every world economy is significantly hampered or significantly damaged by climate change. Pretty much it's everyone that doesn't share a border with the North Pole. I guess I'm looking at you, Canada and Russia. But the vast majority of people in the vast majority of places are really hurt by climate change, and we don't really have good solutions. Here we have one example of this. If you look in California, for the past decade or so, a little bit longer, there's been a policy called the Low Carbon Fuel Standards. Essentially, the policy says it's like a cap and trade system that gets progressively more strict, specifically targeting oil and gas processing. And it says you have this many credits, it's essentially a cap and trade system. And the statutory maximum for it is $200 per metric ton. And, come 2019, it reached that max and has been floating there ever since, even despite the crashes in oil prices. And so what this shows really is that, none of these firms has a solution, has a way to get a metric ton of carbon out of the atmosphere for anything less than $200. And that's an incredibly high price for carbon, if you're sort of familiar with the policy debates. I think the Obama administration priced it around $40 a metric ton. So even at this extremely high price, an extreme financial incentive, firms don't really know how they're going to get carbon out of the atmosphere. I think part of the big problem is how distributed this issue is, right? If there was just one industry or one sector that was causing a lot of the issues with climate change, then that would be one thing. Maybe we could, replace them or focus a lot of energy on figuring out how to reinvent the way we do things. But the truth is that a lot of different aspects of our lives are pretty highly carbon emitting, from the materials we use, the electronics, the food we eat, the way we move around, the power, the electricity that powers our homes and universities. All of these things have pretty significant carbon impacts that each require their own solutions. So as I came into grad school, I thought, this is a big problem. I really should focus on just one aspect of this. And so I focused on hydrogen production. So hydrogen, when you think of it, maybe your initial thoughts, if you're, in the MIT Energy Club, is you're thinking about hydrogen fuel cell cars or using hydrogen as sort of a battery for renewable resources. In truth, though, these are great ideas and certainly will come to pass in the future. But right now, hydrogen is mostly dominated by a couple of industries. First is food. The fertilizers we make require, and actually, I think the next speaker is going to go into this a lot more detail. Nitricity. I think they're specifically targeted around this problem. The food that we eat is largely produced using synthetic fertilizers, and these synthetic fertilizers require hydrogen. Similarly, of course, it's unsurprising that in transportation, not just hydrogen fuel cell cars, few and far between though they may be, but also normal gasoline internal combustion engines. The processing of fuels requires hydrogen gas, not to mention processing of things like jet fuels. But then there are also a host of many other metals, glass, plastics, most synthetic textiles, electronics. All of these things require hydrogen in their synthesis. The issue with this being that the way that 97% of the hydrogen is produced in the world is from hydrocarbons. So you take something like methane and you cool off the hydrogen atoms, you sort of perform it as well with some water. I should be more precise giving a talk at MIT. But the end result is that for every kilogram of hydrogen you make, you're dumping about 10 kilograms of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's actually a little bit less if you're talking about steam methane reforming, a little bit more if you're talking about naphtha or coal gasification. But in average, you might think about it as being something like 10 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram hydrogen. If you sum that across all of these different diverse use cases we talked about, it's something like 1% to 2% of all global CO2 emissions. So that's a big chunk of those diversified carbon emissions that we were talking about earlier. And sort of this combination of hydrogen being so necessary and irreplaceable for so many different things, so for so many necessary industries like agriculture, and it's the predominance of very carbon inefficient methods of producing it, it really drew me to this problem in the first place. And so sort of stepping back ways, I looked, you think about how could you solve this problem? If you had a blank slate, a blank canvas, what's the way you might approach this? I looked at a periodic table and I said, look, where is the hydrogen? What could be potential sources of hydrogen? And you can move and continually block off more and more sections of this periodic table. You'll say, well, does it even bond with hydrogen in appreciable amounts? Is it abundant enough to make a difference at all, right? I mean, currently, the world is producing about $120 billion worth of hydrogen every year. If there's not enough of the material on Earth, then it's probably not going to be an appreciable concern. I should also add that hydrogen concentration in the atmosphere is very low. And then, is the molecule stable enough? Is some candidate molecule that bonds with hydrogen stable enough to accumulate? And you're left with really just a couple of choices on where you could get this hydrogen from. And the first is sort of the status quo brown hydrogen from methane, right? This is, I mean, there's a reason that the world economy is built on getting hydrogen from this thing. It's pretty easy to do. It's pretty low cost to do. The byproducts of its production are non-toxic, at least, sort of at the micro level. Of course, as you get up, it produces carbon dioxide, which is, a different kind of toxic to the planet as a whole. But this is sort of the status quo. Nitricity will talk to us a bit about ammonia, and you'll find that this is one of the main things we need hydrogen for, is to go and produce ammonia. This is sort of that base molecule that you make the ammonium salts for, that are so important for fertilizers. So this doesn't really make sense because you're trying to go the other direction, right? You're trying to go from hydrogen to make ammonia. So it doesn't really make sense to try and gather up a bunch of ammonia and make hydrogen from it. The next is water, and this is a great candidate in a lot of ways. Water, of course, is non-toxic, it's abundant, low cost. The hiccup and the issue is that water is an exceptionally stable molecule. It's exceptionally, when you burn anything, it tries to go to water, right? If you light a match on hydrogen, then it becomes water. And this chemical stability presents a real challenge when you're trying to make hydrogen from water. You can think of it sort of the base chemical, or sort of the thermodynamic energetic barrier, sort of very fundamental, unavoidable barrier to make hydrogen from water is something like 50 kilowatt hours per kilogram of hydrogen. And so if you do some quick mental math, I'm sure you can think about what the base costs of electricity are in the US, and you can see that it's often, in many cases, hard for it to be competitive with other methods of producing hydrogen, just based on that sort of fundamental thermodynamic barriers. The last candidate that we'll look at, and this is sort of what the rest of the talk will be about, is sulfur. And so there's this molecule called hydrogen sulfide. It's terrible in many, many ways. It's extremely toxic. We'll talk about it on the next slide. One thing it's not terrible at is that it's not exceptionally stable. You can see I've put in sort of this enthalpy of formation that's sort of a pseudo stability, I guess I would say. And it's much, much less stable than water. But in every other respect, it's terrible, right? It's, well, I guess it's also naturally abundant. So that's a useful thing if you're trying to find a replacement source of hydrogen. But it's corrosive, explosive, both itself and the thing that it burns into are extremely toxic. The sort of one breath lethal dose is something like 1,000 parts per million. It's not great in a lot of ways. But we looked at the options before, and since this stuff is around, naturally abundant, we figured, this could be a solution. It's certainly not for the faint of heart. And so what are we looking for? Really some type of process, some type of black box that we can have that will put hydrogen sulfide in and get hydrogen gas and some form of sulfur out. Other people have thought about this quite a bit. I'll sort of skip through these slides a little bit. There are a couple of good ideas you might have on how to do this. Of course, as you heat anything up, it'll usually break apart into its constituent elements. There are also electrochemical solutions. These, I would say, I've put sort of quippy lines on the bottom. If you're thermally decomposing things, usually it's too hot. Pretty much any chemical process where you have to get down to ceramics for the materials is not going to be great scaling. Electrochemical, again, if we wanted to put in electricity, then it probably makes sense just to use water. And finally, photochemical, it's hard to scale, especially if one of your byproducts is a solid that's going to cloud up whatever solution it's in. And so this highlights another point that often, if you can avoid using electricity as your input, it's nice to do that. There are a few nice properties of that. Electricity is sort of a higher form of energy. We put in thermal energy to get electrical energy. So if we can just use thermal energy as the base of the process, certainly there are reasons to think it will be less expensive. The carbon intensity also is sort of a mixed bag here. I think in cases where you're talking about doing things electrochemically or through electrolysis, then it makes sense in a big way if you have a lot of renewable energy nearby that's giving you very low carbon intensity electricity. But here, for example, is the carbon intensity of making 1 kilogram of hydrogen from steam methane reforming is something like as I said before, 9 kilograms of CO2. If you're going to electrolyze water to make a kilogram of hydrogen, if you're doing it with, wind nearby, then it's something like 1 kilogram of CO2. If you're using it with a natural gas turbine to generate the electricity, then it's 22 kilograms of CO2. And so there's really a mixed bag here, but if you're in it for the environment, then certainly you need to make sure that the electricity to do this is coming from low carbon sources. But this all motivates the idea that we should try and find a thermal way that we could do that. And the way we looked at that was something called a thermochemical cycle. And so this is something, this is a multi-step chemical process where put in hydrogen sulfide, you often have some type of intermediate that's reacting. But if you draw your box around the whole system, then you achieve some chemistry that you want. Specifically, we looked at reacting these species with iodine intermediates. I won't get in, we can chat later if you're interested in why we targeted these type of halogens. It has a lot to do with sort of how easily you can change the stability of these intermediate molecules. Again, we can chat about it later. And this was a cycle we shot for. We thought, let's try and see if we can make this work. As with most things in research, nothing really goes how you expect it to. In our case, instead of sort of oxidizing to elemental sulfur, we kept seeing sulfur dioxide, and we kept getting a lot more of these intermediates than we expected. And it came down to this, there's some very old paper about the over-oxidation of thiols beyond what they expected. But what it came down to is we weren't actually getting that process or those chemical steps we were getting before. We were getting this type of chemical reaction where we were both reacting hydrogen sulfide, iodine, and water to produce hydrodic acid and sulfur dioxide, as opposed to before we had thought that we would get hydrogen sulfide plus iodine going to hydrodic acid plus elemental sulfur. So there's a difference there, of course, is that we're generating a lot more of these reactive intermediates and thus a lot more hydrogen at the end. And instead of elemental sulfur, we're getting sulfur dioxide. That might seem like a bad thing because sulfur dioxide is also a toxic gas, but there are actually some nice properties around making sure you don't have solids forming in your system and clogging everything up. So once we sort of worked in the lab, and again, I won't dwell too long on what we did in the lab. We'll have a couple slides on it later. Once we decided that this was working and this was something we wanted to pursue, you start building up models of how you think this is going to work. Again, we start with a very simplified. What are the really basic things that you need? Well, you need reactors to do each of the reaction steps, and you need separators to separate each of the key components. You again can build it out in more detail. You can just something like this, where you try and expect what the chemical process units are going to look like alongside their step-by-step sort of chemistry. Again, I would emphasize here that one sort of crucial aspect of this process is the heat integration. Sort of we're cycling between a few different reaction conditions. And so it's important to be able to integrate that heat as well as you can. And finally, you can, of course, we do this all the time, but you generate Aspen process models or other types of process models to try and give you a good sense of carbon costs, the energy costs, the VLE, sort of the separation steps. Lots and lots of details go into these models. And if you put them all together, then you hope that you can get a good idea of if this is feasible or not. So that's what we did. Parallel to that, we sort of worked to scale it up. So as I said at the beginning, we initially started with these very small prototypes, I would say. We were testing individual steps and sort of putting them together in very, very limited, very, very small scale operations. In some respects, we're dealing with hydrogen sulfide. So it's not like we're bringing cupcakes to work. It's a pretty toxic gas, as I mentioned before. But you work to scale this up. Each time you're successful at a smaller scale, you go up a little bit to a larger scale. Eventually, we've gone up to a pretty appreciable scale. Certainly not an industrial scale yet, although that's where we're working on right now. But large enough to convince ourselves that this works, and the scaling seems to be favorable. So once you have a good idea about your technology and what you want to do, it's important to find someone that cares about it. And so you think about all the different markets that might be able to get value from this technology you created. For us, initially, I was very set on this idea of oil refineries. And I know that's like a terrible, maybe a bad word in the MIT Energy Nights or something, but it's this idea that you know, at these oil refineries, they have a lot of hydrogen sulfide. And so, and they also have a great need for hydrogen gas. And so if somehow we can close this recycle loop and take that sour gas and convert it into hydrogen, then it seemed like a very, very strong value proposition to me. Of course, there are other places that also have strong, very large, high volume feeds of this toxic sour gas, hydrogen sulfide. Here in the oil and gas, you often characterize things as upstream, midstream, or downstream, whether it's at the well pads, at the gas processing sites, or at the hydrocarbon refineries. And each of them sort of has a slightly different scale of operation and value proposition. I would also highlight that it's not just oil and gas that has these sour gas streams, but hydrogen sulfide is generated by the anaerobic decomposition of biomass. So when you think about biogas, they also have not quite as large streams of hydrogen sulfide, but some hydrogen sulfide. Biorefining as well, particularly operations where you're dealing with the gasification of biomass followed by Fischer-Tropsch units to convert it into a liquid fuel. They again have this strong preference. They need hydrogen to balance their Fischer-Tropsch unit, but if you're just getting hydrogen from natural gas or methane, then it's, what's the purpose? What's the point of doing that? And so looking at each of these, the question then becomes, where do you go first, right? And as you think about that, again, the question you might think is where's the problem the sharpest? And this has to do with your economic modeling, where you know the value propositions, the margins, the stories of different people, decision makers involved, their opinions, their attitudes. Who do you trust not to mess it up? If you're taking a truly revolutionary new technology to market, you don't want your first cases to turn out poorly, right? And so you need to go somewhere with competent people that you trust are going to operate well. And then finally, and maybe this is even most important, where can you move the fastest? So for me, even though we had this beautiful value proposition, this beautiful ability to, reduce hundreds of thousands, millions even of metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year at this refinery downstream locations, they move slow. Refinery upgrades happen once every 5 years or more. And even getting it in involves decisions of dozens and dozens and dozens of people. And so for us, we've put that market, even though they have this great value proposition, even though they have these great ideas, this great idea to integrate it there, we've sort of left that behind for now, at least through our technology validation stage, and have moved upstream and are looking at oil and gas well pads where they, again, have quite a lot of hydrogen sulfide, but it's not quite the same scale. But even more importantly, you only have to convince 2 people this is a good idea to make it work there. And so that's what we're doing. And so a lot of our work right now is focused on building and generating this upstream pilot. The next thing it's really important to know is, and this goes into deciding which of these, where you're going or how you're going to bring this technology into reality, is understanding what your technology does for people. So as a case study of us, initially you look at this and you think, well, it makes hydrogen, right? It makes low carbon hydrogen. You're getting hydrogen from sulfur gases rather than from, natural gas. And that is one thing, certainly, but there's also arguments around safety improvement. Again, remember this hydrogen sulfide is an extremely toxic gas no one wants to deal with. If you look up OSHA, you can see dozens and dozens of accident and incident reports around hydrogen sulfide poisonings, and also is the carbon reduction itself. When you think about hydrogen value, right, we're tuned to think about it in terms of hydrogen fuel cells, hydrogen cars, sort of these visions of a hydrogen economy. In truth, though, if we're out in the middle of nowhere in West Texas, it's hard to figure out exactly what you're going to do with the hydrogen, right? Hydrogen is such a volatile, hard to transport material that compression, transportation, distribution costs often dominate the production costs and the overall finances associated with these types of projects. So there's lots of different options. Here I just illustrate a couple to sort of illustrate this idea that it's good to be creative about what you do and think about all the options and pick the ones that make sense. And it's not necessarily the financial return that makes sense. There's a lot of arguments around ease of operation and what are the lowest barrier to entry opportunities. Next, I mentioned safety before. The status quo really is that it was a funny story. I was chatting with someone who operated a well site, and he said, their stated safety protocol for sour gas problems is that when the alarm goes off, you go and look up the windsock. You see which direction the wind is blowing and run perpendicular to the wind. And for me, that's such a crazy story about, there's quite a strong potential for safety improvements if you can remove this toxic gas from the waste streams. Finally, thinking about carbon emissions, this figure on the left is called the McKinsey curve. Essentially what it says is on the y-axis, you're seeing sort of the financial returns associated with various carbon emission reduction technologies. On the right, you have sort of from left to right, you have the cumulative impact of those technologies. And what you'll immediately notice is that a lot of these carbon emission reduction activities, by this estimation, are financially incentivized. And so they're things that we should do. And we calculate that this technology is as well. If you look at it per site, it's something, as I said, 60 to 100,000 tons of CO2 per day, or per site per year, I should say. If you think about it in terms of total, it's always nice, when you go to people to be able to give a ceiling. When we look at all the hydrogen sulfide in the world, produced, I think 2 years ago, we estimate that we could, if we turned it into hydrogen, compared to the status quo methods of hydrogen production, we'd look at saving something like 300 million tons of CO2 per year. So again, this is not the complete solution by any means, but it's like putting a solar panel on all the houses in the US. So it's a pretty big solution as well. So let's summarize where we've come so far. We found a problem we cared about. We found a solution that we liked, and we convinced ourselves that it would work. We found people that care about solving that problem. And so the last step really is to execute on this, is to act to make this. And so I'm coming from the perspective of someone that just finished their doctorate at MIT and was working on these issues. But the first step really is to build a team. You really need other people to succeed. And this is something that I think is under a lot of times. I mean, a lot of R&D work is collaborative, but a lot of it is done individually as you struggle over writing those papers, right? And so luckily MIT is a great ecosystem and has a ton of programming for helping you find teams. I would say you should find, and I hesitate to talk as my co-founder AJ Bob is in the audience now, make sure that you find people you like, but you don't like that much. You want to be able to have honest conversations with people. And if you're, you have to be able to speak the truth and speak honestly with your co-founders, and you have to be able to give each other honest, hard feedback. And so like each other, don't like each other too much. And you also need some credibility, right? So as you build a team, be on the lookout for people. And even if they are on your founding team, it's easy to recruit people to boards of directors, to advisory boards, these type of things. People that will give you credibility, and then people that will take a long, hard look at what you're doing and give you their honest opinion about it. The second step of this sort of execution phase is really to, after you build a team, to make a plan. Really, to exist as a company, you really need to generate value or make money, right? I mean, I guess my mantra is that, it's probably not, I'm not the first or only one that said this, but solutions that really don't make money or don't generate value don't scale. And if your solution doesn't scale, then you're not going to have an impact. It doesn't matter if you have a technology that can reduce carbon emissions to zero for, half of all carbon emissions. If it doesn't make money, then it's not going to scale. And if it's not going to scale, it's not going to have that impact. And a part of this goes back to sort of my comments at the beginning about how a lot of things right now are mispriced. But sort of the world we live in, you have to adapt to it until we can figure out how to change it. The final step I would say is what I call the rule of pi. And that's that as you execute on things, everything takes a lot longer than you expect it to or than you think it should. And so give yourself time. Here I say the actual time to complete things is about pi times how much you expect originally. So make sure you give yourself the time and resources to succeed. So in conclusion, find a problem you deeply care about, find a solution you believe in, find the people that care about the problem the most, then execute to make it a reality. I've done that with Thiozen as I finished up my PhD work and moved into the sort of realm of entrepreneurship. But it's something that I think, many people in this audience, I mentioned there's quite a few members of the MIT community here. I think that it's something that, anyways, sound advice. So that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Ryan, for your presentation. That was very interesting. I'll be monitoring questions. So we're receiving some on the Huva web app, and it says, someone asked, will it be possible in the future to capture and control carbon dioxide completely?
Yeah, so I mean, these are big questions, right? It's like how, what future does carbon capture have? In the realm of hydrogen, we would call that blue hydrogen, right? It's hydrogen that you make with SMR, but you're on the tail end of your process. You've put in a lot of stuff to try and reduce the carbon dioxide associated. The current technologies do not capture. So I'll leave the grand question maybe to the audience or to the next keynote speakers who I think might do a better job answering it. I'll say specifically thinking about hydrogen production, the current carbon capture technologies, it's one of these things where you have diminishing efficiency. You know, you can spend 50 cents a kilogram of hydrogen and get 60% of the carbon dioxide out of the emissions. But to get that last 40% is pretty challenging. So I think you can certainly do anything. It will all come down to how things are priced and what makes sense economically.
Great, thank you. We also received another one. Are there future applications for the large amount of sulfur that is being produced in this process?
Yeah, so it's funny. This is to me a very ironic and very real problem. Is that there's in the world economy, you look at what is the highest commodity, or by mass, what's the largest commodity chemical, and it's actually sulfuric acid. For a long time, countries could use it as sort of a pseudo GDP, how much sulfuric acid they produce. And so it's not like there aren't things to do with sulfur, but as this person points out, still we generate way more sulfur than we know what to do with. And it's a tricky thing because you don't really want sulfur in consumer goods, even in things like pavement or road paving or concrete or construction material. When you heat it up, it's probably going to oxidize and go to sulfur dioxide, which you really don't want to be breathing in. So this is a really challenging and interesting problem. I've thought about it a bit. I don't have really great solutions. Certainly, there's been a lot of work to try and make polymers that you could do from sulfur. Again, I would say what often makes the most sense to do with sulfur is turn it into sulfuric acid, but the sort of supply is well outpacing demand, and will probably that trend will accelerate. So all MIT undergrads, if you're looking for a really interesting and potentially very lucrative problem, figuring out what to do with sulfur. I mean, you look at Canada, you can go on Google Maps, and if you look, I can't remember the city name in Alberta right now, but if you go just north of it, you can see these pyramids of sulfur that they're just dumping on the ground. And if you look at by volume, they're already much greater than sort of the pyramids in Egypt, and certainly viewable, visible from space. They're just piles of sulfur that nobody knows what to do with. Eventually, a forest fire will come through, and it'll be a big catastrophe. But I guess people will cross that bridge when it gets there.
Thank you. And then we'll take one last question that received a couple votes. Considering the climate tipping point the world has reached, which source, solar or hydrogen, can become affordable to average consumers in earliest time to help avoid the snares of global warming?
Well, I think this has a lot to do with what you're talking about using it for, right? For a lot of things and in a lot of locations, solar is going to make a lot of sense, right? If you're in a high sunlight location, solar is already extremely cost competitive with conventional electricity use. Hydrogen, though, is different, right? Certainly, there's a future where the hydrogen economy really takes off, and it's used as a pseudo battery for renewable resources, or these type of things where you're using fuel cells to generate electricity from it. However, right now, it's already a huge carbon sink, or huge carbon source, I should say, and we don't really use it for that at scale at all. It's all about it being a commodity chemical, and I don't think solar panels. Certainly there's a lot of really great work, and you'll hear about it with nitricity in just, I think, a few minutes, around electrifying different heavy chemical processes. But when I think about, the need for hydrogen and low carbon hydrogen, really I'm focused on these heavy chemicals activities that already exist.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryan.